Okay, and hello and welcome. My name is Martin, and in today's tutorial, what we're going to be doing is we're going to be examining the differences between a static mesh and a geometry. Both of those things are going to be available here from the place actors. The static meshes will be available through the basic, and then the geometries will actually be here in a folder called geometry. Now, the essential difference between a static mesh and a geometry is that a static mesh is an object that has already been formed, and really the only three things that you can do to it as far as changing its shape would be changing its position on the in the screen on the screen in the game area, changing its rotation and changing its scale in relationship to other objects. Otherwise, the object is pretty much finalized. The other advantage that the static meshes will give us is the ability to be able to add blueprints to them. So as we move on later, we will see that if we use geometries, we will actually not be able to attach not as easily the blueprints to them. So when we create characters or pawns, we will be using the static meshes. Now, the other thing also with a static mesh is that it takes up a lot less space. It costs less processing power to use a static mesh than it does to use a geometry. So if you use a geometry, essentially what you're doing is you're creating something that has multiple surfaces that you can apply different things to, that you can change the shape, size, what it is that thing is doing, that the geometry is doing, and by leaving it as a geometry, when you go to export it from your game, that thing will actually take up more processing power because there's more things that are available to manipulate that object with. Whereas in the static mesh, it's more about things being attached to it as opposed to it having a lot of options itself in the way of, let's say, blueprints and codes and what you're going to do with it on screen. And it takes less processing power from the computer to be able to generate that object. Now, there's also some other properties that will happen back and forth between a static mesh and a geometry. So we're going to look at this square object first, and we're going to look into its details panel to see different things that we can add, that we can do to it. So the first thing that we'll see is we have the transform tool. We should be pretty familiar with that, having just looked at that tool recently, but we also have something called mobility. So we have the ability to make something static, make it movable, and keep it this will allow it to change, but it stays in its location. This means that it always stays in its location, and this means that somehow it's able to be moved. Now, from here, I also have the static mesh. You can see that that's why I'm calling it a static mesh, because it says it's a static mesh. From here, I can also pick and make this something else. So if I wanted to change this from a cube to a circle, to a sphere, you can see that I've done that there. Let's change it to a pillar. Okay, so just because, this is actually where you would change the actual shape that is part of, considered this object. From there, the other thing we have is a material. So a material we haven't really talked about yet. What it is the covering that you see on the outside. So if I look at this material, you see that right now it's called basic shape material. If I click there, I'll see that I have different options. So if I wanted to change this to the yellow color that the projectile is made out of, there it is. And also I can scroll down and maybe I want this to, well, that looks kind of weird, doesn't it? Let's pick something that's a little bit more solid. Okay. I guess that's more like a marbled floor. That looks kind of cool. So it says ceramic tile. Okay. Now the thing about what we've, and let's just keep looking down. So we have that, we have physics. We also have the ability to assign collisions to this. And when we get into chapter 4, we'll talk more about that. We'll talk about lighting later, but basically you can see that there are quite a few different things that you can do to this, as far as changing its location, its location, its shape, and its rotation, changing whether the object is movable or static, meaning it does not move, what the object itself is, the material on the outside of that object, Also, anytime you see this little arrow right there, that just lets you know that there are hidden options that are available there, and at some point we will get into those. Physics would be how it relates to gravity. Collisions would be how it deals with other objects. Can things walk through it? Can things would you bump into it and bounce off of it, or would you be able to go through the object? And again, we'll get to that later. So that is a static mesh. Now from there, and I'm just going to put that on the floor so it's on the floor. Now from there, and actually this is a bad skin because I don't want to have it look checkered. So I'm going to go back to the original base material. All right, so from there, I'm now going to grab a geometry. So again, that's in the geometry folder. I'm going to grab geometry and put that on the ground. And you'll see that this comes in with a different set of options for in the details panel. Now, the first thing that you'll see is that you have location, rotation, and scale. So those things are still available with this object. But then we go into what's called brush settings. In the upcoming chapters, we'll be talking a little bit more about this, but you see that I have both an X, Y, and a Z axis that's there. So I could scale this, and if I scale it, let's grab the Z axis and make the Z axis bigger. You'll notice that it actually stretched these pixels that are in there. Now, if I had a material that was on there, that would actually stretch the material itself and make it feel stretched. Like you would, it's sort of like if you take a Photoshop document and it was really, really small and you tried to blow the document up, you would start to see the pixelation inside the document or inside the image. That's exactly what's happening here. So the neat thing that a geometry allows us to do is to be able to create a really large object and place a material on there that then we have control over how the material looks and the feel of the material itself. So I'm going to put this back to 1 so that all our squares are the same size and there is no stretching on this object. So the way that you really want to make this work is by going and changing the actual dimensions of it. So now that you'll actually look at this and you'll see that instead of stretching the squares that were there, it actually added more squares. Right? So instead of the 2 that we saw, we now have 4 because I went from 200 units to 400 units. If I multiply that again, we should get a total of 8 units, or 8 of these checkerboard squares that are on the side, right? So we're making the object bigger without actually stretching it. Now, the other thing that also allows us that we can do with this is that we can change the appearance of these, but let's go ahead and add a material. In the other object, let's see, where is materials here? There we go. So underneath surface materials, we actually have none right now. This is the default checkerboard for the geometry. So to find materials, I'm going to make sure that I have selected the content folder. I am then going to go into starter content. Remember, this is the folder that I told you should download when you install, or when you start the default template. And we're going to go from here to material. So there's a folder underneath content, starter content, materials, and if we click on that, we will actually then get to see a bunch of different materials that we can then place on the geometry. Now, the neat thing about the geometry is that if I place an object or a material on the geometry, I'm actually just applying it to one surface or to one side. So if this wall or this barrier needed to be different, have different materials on either side, all I'd have to do is do that. And now we can see that if I select this and go into, let's see, where is it giving me? There it is. So we can see that I have that side selected, or I have that side selected, and we can see the surface materials there. If I select the object, I believe as a hold, so if I grab, let me see, all adjacent sides, select all adjacent slant surfaces, it's all matching brushes. There we go. So essentially what I've done now is I've selected all the brushes, all the different kind of brushes, and we can see that I basically selected the whole material. And by selecting the whole material, I now see the 2 different types of material that were being used for this object. So that's kind of neat. Now let me put actually something that's got like a repeating pattern on here, sort of like this brick. So we're going to grab this and put the brick on there. Now also, if you wanted to add the brick to all 4 or all 6 sides, because it is a cube, or it is a rectangular shape, you could go in and say, you select it, you go select, select all adjacent surfaces, which grabs everything, and then you grab this and drop it on one surface, and you'll see that it, instead of dropping it on just that surface, it has applied it to all the other surfaces, right? Now, once we have this, we might look at this and go, okay, on this side I want the bricks to go left to right, on this side I want the bricks to go in a different direction. So with just, I'm going to click somewhere else and then click on one side, and with that one side selected, I can then come here to the rotation tool and let's say rotate this 90 degrees. So now I have a way more control over what this object is doing and the way that the materials and the surfaces are being applied. Now let's say I wanted the bricks to look bigger up here than they look down there on the sides. I can again select this one surface. I'm going to hit the lock tool, so then that way it keeps both of these the same, and let's say I go to 2, so when I've typed in tool here, it made the 2 apply, and then we'll do that. So now the brick on the top feel like twice the size of the bricks on the bottom, and we get the ability to be able to change the material. So that would be underneath surface properties. Now that surface properties is not available, let's say, on a static mesh. So if I select a static mesh and I grab those same bricks and throw them in there, I do get the bricks, but I don't have any ability to be able to make any changes to the way that those bricks are orientated or the way that they appear on the static mesh. So what I like to do is start off with geometries, make the geometry look the way that I need the geometry to look. And the neat thing about the geometries is that you can actually eventually end up turning them into a static mesh. So you would go to geometry. Let's see. That option is underneath. There it is. So underneath the brush settings, we select the entire object. So that would be like that. I can see that the gold box is going all the way around. The side that I've selected, of course, has got the brighter side, but there is a gold box going all the way around, letting me know that I've got the whole thing selected. Once the whole thing is selected, I went underneath brush settings, and there is a hidden menu there. So we open up the hidden menu and we can say create static mesh. It's going to ask us where we want to store the static mesh, and depending on what the object is, maybe you'll create a folder that is specifically for that. Now remember that you can also see the same folder structure here. So we have content, first person BP, geometry, and then starter content. If you want to, what I would do here is right click, create a new folder, and that folder actually, yeah, it's parallel. So you can put a folder inside of a folder by dragging it into the folder. And if you did that, you can see that you're getting a check mark and you would actually be moving it into that. But if you keep it outside of a folder where the hand is not touching another folder, it keeps it on the outside. Now I can double click on that and I should be able to change the name of it. Okay, so let's try to create a new folder before the name thing goes away. Let's add it and let's call it A underscore my static or my materials. Let's call it my no, because materials actually means something. So let's call it my stuff. So A underscore my stuff, and then I'm going to pull that out of the folder that it's in. Okay, well, it's being incredibly stubborn. You don't want to continue until, okay, so maybe if I do it that way, move here, there we go. And I will show you another way to be able to get this done, and then later I can go back and erase that one. I do want to remind you that as you put materials into your into these folders. If you move the object, it's going to create missing media. The project won't know where the object went, so you want to try to avoid that as much as possible. So that's why I wanted to make sure that the folder was in the correct location underneath content and that it had the right name on it before I save this. So I'm going to go ahead and rename this. We'll call this wall mesh, and remember that you can't have any spaces, so wall mesh with an underscore. And there is a certain naming convention that people will use just to make things easier to read. So capital W space capital M, and let's call this wall mesh small mesh 1. And I'm going to make sure it's in that folder. And there we go. So now when I look at this object, I see that there it is. So it has now gone from a geometry to a static mesh, and from there we now have the attributes that that a static mesh would have, collision settings and things that were not available with the geometry. And now we have something that we have modified, and we've basically created our own static mesh from using a geometry. And we now see some of the major differences that would happen with that, and why sometimes using a geometry is more useful to at least create some of your base shapes. And then from there, you can turn those into static meshes. And if I needed to make another one, I could just go to my world outliner, select the object, find that it's right there, right click on it and say duplicate. And I believe this is in edit. There it is, duplicate. So it'd be Control W to duplicate an object. And now I have 2 of them. So if I needed to create a passageway, if these were going to be columns in a in an arena, whatever, you now have 2 of those things that are the same object and look the same, and are not going to take up a lot of computing power. And like I said earlier, you can assign blueprints too. Okay, so that's it for this video. In the next video, what we'll do is we will get this area actually set up for our first project, so that when we actually start creating the environment for our character to be in, this area will look a little bit nicer than it does right now. Okay, so I hope you enjoyed the video and have a wonderful day. Bye-bye.